In order, welcome to the Committee on the Budgets hearing on Oversight, the Congressional Budget Office. Today we'll hear testimony from the Honorable Philip Swagel, the Director of Congressional Budget Office. I want to yield myself now, such time as I may consume, to just frame this up for today. We're going to conduct our constitutional and legal oversight responsibility. And I want everyone to understand that that we haven't had an oversight hearing, which is our congressional and constitutional responsibility, in 6 years. In 6 years. So before I levy the constructive criticism on your operation and have constructively critical questions of you, I want to first take ownership of and speak to Congress's responsibility and oversight. We have 40% roughly of our programs, departments, agencies that have not been authorized that we continue to fund. That is a massive dereliction of oversight responsibility. We have a growing amount of improper payments, and what was $150 billion a year prior to COVID is now $230 billion a year. And the authorizing committees, the oversight committee, the budget committee, we're not doing our job well in stewardship of tax dollars by allowing that improper payment number to continue to grow with very little done to bend the curve on that. So we passed a budget resolution out of this committee for the first time in 5 years. I mean, a real budget resolution, not a shell for reconciliation. Both parties have done it. This isn't to shame any party. It's to say we have got to set a better standard for doing our job that the people sent us here to do, and that the Constitution and the law requires. So the CBO was created in '74 in the Congressional Budget Act, and the current budget process along with it. 50 years of this budget process, Phil, we look to make the changes necessary to give greater incentive for members of Congress to do the right and responsible thing. That's underway. It's a bipartisan effort. The mission of CBO, I'm sure you'll speak to this, but as I understand it, is to assist the budget committees of the House and Senate with information and analysis so that we can conduct our legislative business. That's all legislation, appropriations, budget-related, authorizing legislation as well. And that you report to this committee and to the committee, the budget committee in the Senate. It's my understanding that the customer that utilizes your information, trust and relies on the objectivity and the accuracy of it, is members of Congress. And we're doing the work of the American people. Their will is reflected in our lawmaking. So we've got to get the information analysis as accurate and as timely as possible for us to serve the American people well. There's a host of factors that contribute to timeliness and accuracy, in my humble opinion. Methodology, making sure we understand what the methodology is, what's in the black box that spits out these scores and other analyses. Outside input, what input do you rely on from other sources? Who are the other sources? Are they balanced in terms of their philosophical views and ideological views? Is there enough transparency for criticism and peer review from these entities? Not the least of which would be our committee and other members of Congress. How are you organized? Do you have the capacity to be timely? Do you have the resources? Do you have the expertise? Do you have metrics and goals? And do you have the incentives, carrots and sticks, to make sure that we're getting the right outcome out of CBO? Reporting documents. How often do you report? Are they clear so that I can understand if we're off by $1 trillion on the deficit, that I don't have to go find an email buried in my stack of emails to learn of that? Is that something we're communicating directly about? Is that something that my Democrat colleagues and my ranking member also have in a timely way? I've got to engage more. I'm going to say that right now. You and I have to talk more. This committee needs more time with you, informally and formally. We're going to have more oversight hearings, and we're going to work together to get this communication flow both ways working better than it has been over the last year. It's my first year. I plan to do a lot better. And Phil, we've got a plan. We've got a plan to deal with improper payments. We've got a plan to deal with getting our budget done on time. We've got a plan to focus on mandatory and not obsess over just the discretionary budget. We have a plan to hold authorizers accountable for unauthorized spending. So we've got a plan to do better, and we have to. But I need to understand what the plan is to do better at CBO, because, and I don't want to, I know I'm going overtime here, so I'm going to shut this down because I don't want to revolt here on the dais. But there's just, it's not just the deficit off by over 100% and underreporting. G.T. Thompson sent a letter, and you should read every chairman's letter. But he said over the last 10 years, it's just an example, the farm programs, the commodity programs, were overestimating in their spend by 80% of the time, not by 80%, 80% of the time. The nutrition program was underestimated over the last 10 years, 60% of the time. And I've just got a litany of your customers who are very concerned with those key objectives, timeliness and accuracy, without going through all of them that I've written down. I know there'll be time for questions, but I hope you will agree that we can do better. I'm going to do my part, and I want you to hear today from my colleagues about their sentiments and their perception. But by the way, if you ask me or my mom, I'm tall, dark, and handsome, and I do everything just perfectly. But the real question is, how do my colleagues here think I'm doing? How do my Republican colleagues in the steering committee who elected me for this position think I'm doing? How do my constituents? Phil, the question is, how does your customer perceive you? Because for better and for worse, that's the job you're doing. And that's the job I'm doing. And I believe these guys are your customers at a minimum. Maybe I'd say in this room, they're your customers, your shareholders, and your bosses, all of them. So with that, I'd ask my ranking member for his comments as well, as much time as you may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank everyone for being here, including our guests. First, before I direct my comments to Mr. Swagel and talk about Congressional Budget Office, first, I just want to share great news that should make all of us happy here, and I know it will. Headline from a publication not known to being friendly to this administration: U.S. winning world economic war. The first sentence: the United States economy grew faster than any other large advanced economy last year by a wide margin and is on track to do so again in 2024. Almost every day, we are seeing headlines just like that and the economic data underlying it to support it. And that is all news that we can, as Americans, take great pride in. Now, to the express purpose of today's hearing, I want to thank you, Mr. Swagel, as I have done a number of times in private. I want to thank you individually, but also the 270 or so staffers who you represent, fine public servants who perform an incredibly important function and do so with diligence and professionalism. I also want to thank the chairman for the fact that we are taking time today to conduct oversight of the Congressional Budget Office, talk about things that are working well, and also things that we can improve. I would, however, urge caution to any colleagues today who intend to raise questions about CBO's impartiality, transparency, or the accuracy of their projections writ large. The reality is, and you can look over the last several decades, CBO at times has both underprojected and overprojected deficits, underprojected and overprojected revenues, and released projections that were politically inconvenient to both Democrats and Republicans. I personally know that I think when CBO releases a projection that I agree with, you guys are doing a fantastic job. And when you release one I disagree with, that damn CBO, what are they thinking? I have a feeling all 435 members of the House might find that rather familiar in what I just said. It is impossible to 100% predict the future. The famous physicist Niels Bohr once said, predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. And certainly if there is someone here who had a way to predict, for instance, an unprecedented global pandemic or the Great Recession, well, I would love to speak to you before I get in my bet on this year's Super Bowl. So the reality is this. Despite the challenges of making predictions, and despite not having a perfect record, time in and time out, CBO does high-quality work. But again, I am open toward ways that we can improve the process and ultimately improve the end product. Toward that end, I'm incredibly proud that just last week, I introduced a bill, co-sponsored by Chairman Arrington, that would help reduce the delays that CBO often suffers in receiving data that they need to support congressional decision-making. And frankly, this has been a chronic problem, whether it's a Democratic administration or Republican administration, and it's incumbent upon us in Congress to solve. Speaking of the role of Congress and not CBO, we're going to talk today about a, quote, culture of fiscal responsibility. Let's be clear. It's not the role of the CBO to inculcate a fiscally responsible culture. That's our job as members of Congress. So let's not pass the blame or pass the buck onto the men and women of CBO for those instances in which this institution has failed. So with that, I will pause here, give back the remaining 30 seconds of my time, and I thank you again, Mr. Swagel, and the men and women of the Congressional Budget Office.
Speaking of timeliness, my ranking member always likes to point out when he finishes his remarks in that 5-minute time frame. So I appreciate that. I know my colleagues do.
A culture of responsibility.
For sure. It starts at the top, they say, right? Okay, I appreciate the comments by the ranking member. In the interest of time, if any members have opening statements, I ask that you submit them for the record. I'll hold the record open at the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not have prepared written statements. Now let's turn it over to Director Swagel. Again, thank you for your time. I won't go through your resume, but it's awfully impressive. Federal Reserve, Council of Economic Advisors, think tanks, higher education, and now second term at CBO. We appreciate you being here, and the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the work of the
Dr. Swagel, turn that, if you would. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you for inviting me to testify about the work of the Congressional Budget Office. We're here to support you, to support the Congress, and oversight is a key part of that, of making sure that we're supporting you as you need us to do. I will focus in my testimony on the accuracy of our deficit projection, but then I look forward to answering questions on any topic. So compared with our May 2022 projections, we underestimated outlays for fiscal year 23 by $564 billion, or 9%, and we overestimated revenues by $477 billion, which is 11%. So together, that's the $1 trillion miss, so to speak. This underestimate of the deficit was about 4 times greater than our average miss. So let me go through the largest factors affecting that accuracy. And the largest factors were actions taken by the administration after our projections were made. So about $125 billion of the underestimate of outlays reflected student loans. So this is the cost of modifications, the income-driven repayment plan, and an extended pause in repayments and interest accrual. $60 billion on the outlay side was unusual outlays from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, associated with the resolution of 4 bank failures. There was another $40 billion associated with those failures, so a total of 100, but there's a sense in which the $40 billion was the normal way they respond to a bank failure, and $60 billion was unusual. There's $170 billion of the outlay miss resulted from our estimates of net interest spending being too small. And this is on us, that our interest rate projections were too low. And then there's lots of other things. $50 billion was from other effects of our economic projections. For example, we underestimated Social Security outlays because our inflation estimate was too low. And then there's the employee retention tax credit, which affects both outlays and revenues. Now, the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation is responsible for estimates of tax policies. And when that legislation was put into effect, they estimated that the credit, the ERTC, would have budgetary effects in 2020, 2021, and 2022, but no effect in 2023. So in our May 2022 baseline, we had nothing for the ERTC. The costs of the ERTC in 2023 were large, over $100 billion between outlays and revenues, and it looks to continue into the current year. On the revenue side, there are actions taken by the administration that totaled $120 billion that delayed tax revenues from 2023 into 2024. And this is the delays in payments for people affected by disasters in California, for example. And then there are delays in the implementation of guidance for the minimum corporate tax. I mentioned already the ERTC on the revenue side. That was about $70 billion. And then $40 billion on the revenue side was, again, our interest rate projections affecting our projections of remittances from the Fed. There's lots more, but the overall point is that some of the miss is our miss, our inflation forecast, our interest rate forecast, and some of it is actions taken after our projections were done that I think we reasonably could not have anticipated. Now, each month in our monthly budget review, we provide an update on how outlays and revenues compare with the amounts in the previous year. And so we regularly discuss how outcomes differ compared to, to our projections. We will release new projections next Wednesday. And I'll just mention a couple things, that the deficit was going to be smaller because of the Fiscal Responsibility Act and the subsequent continuing resolutions. On the other hand, net interest costs are going to be higher. Interest rates have gone up. And then the one that's relevant here is that the tax provisions from the 2022 reconciliation bill, those costs are going to be much higher than we had originally because of the market has changed, the implementation is different than what the Joint Committee on Taxation expected. So that's just another example of administrative actions that affect our projections. So let me stop and say, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, I'm happy to be here and to answer questions on any topic.
Thank you, Mr. Swagel. We'll now begin the Q&A session, and I will yield myself 5 minutes for that. Okay, so I appreciate my ranking member making the comment about fiscal responsibility, and the culture of fiscal responsibility is our mantle to bear, and our goal for the taxpayers of this great nation. I agree with that. What we're talking about with respect to culture is to say, what are the cultural challenges that CBO has or is reflected in the outcomes? Is there a culture of accountability? Is there a culture of welcoming criticism through transparency and peer review? Is there a culture of customer service where you're engaging the customers and stakeholders regularly and they feel heard, and your job is objectivity. It's a nonpartisan, accurate product of scoring or some other economic analysis, but but input and engagement from the customers is important. So that's the culture, Dr. Swagel, we're talking about. And those are the questions I think you have to ask as the CEO of CBO, and that's what we have to ask as your oversight authority. If being a good guy and a smart guy were the only measures of success, you'd be an A+. And if intentions were the measure of success for Congress, probably we'd all be A+, because I don't question the intentions of anybody in here, including Earl Blumenauer over there. I know I am, but it's true. I think the intentions generally are good. We have different views on how to allow our country to be on a path of progress and all that, but I think people generally want this country to succeed. We have different views of the role of government, for example. But that's not the metric here. It's not intentions. It's not a good nature. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to say, what other scoring entities exist? What other forecasting entities exist? What surveys of other forecasters? How are we doing relative to our peers? Not how do we think we're doing, or how nice do we think we are, or how smart are we? The blue chip group of economic projectors, the Federal Reserve, Penn Wharton, in my estimation, and we can go back and forth, get it more right than CBO gets it right. And we have data that I'll submit for the record on that. 6 years ago, there was 3 years of about 3 or 4% error rate from the projection to what was the actual deficit, just speaking about your projections on the deficit. But the last 3 years, it's been almost 25% in 1 year, 12% in another, and then over 100%. So this business of everybody's just doing great, Lake Woebegone, and we're all just rocking along as we should. First of all, it's not true about the Budget Committee. It's not true about my Republican conference. It's not true about this institution or the Democrats, and it's not true about the CBO. And so unless we're honest with each other, and unless we use objective data to know if we're doing a good job or not, and listening to the customer, hell, we don't know. We're just BSing ourselves and the American people. Dr. Swagel, I've got so many things here. I guess I'm just going to refer to one statement that you make in your written statement, where you talk about at the time of the forecast for the deficit, the forecasts are typically similar to those of other forecasters. That's not what I'm seeing from the Federal Reserve, Penn Wharton, and others. For me, 8 quarters, 6 out of 8 in some categories, 8 out of 8 in others, were wrong on inflation, on interest rate, on GDP. And I'm not even getting to the scoring piece of legislation and some of the concerns. And I would ask you to take the time to dig into the chairman of authorizing committee's letters and their sentiments and their specific examples of concerns. But then I flip over to the survey of professional forecasters, and you say that your forecast was at the lower end of the middle 2/3 range. And I'm not even sure what 2/3 is, a big swath, and you're at the lower end. I don't know if that means you're at the lower quartile or not, but I think it does. And so I'm just going to end there with, if that's true and it's really the bottom quartile, that means we can do better. Can we all just agree we can do better? Okay? That's the framing, and that's kind of the bottom line for me, and I'll let the rest of my colleagues dig into the specifics. Again, Dr. Swagel, I appreciate it's a tough job. Predictions are tough to get right, but man, we can do a whole lot better. With that, I yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes for his questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Swagel. Let me ask you about the CBO Data Sharing Act, which I alluded to in my opening statement. And for those who are interested and want to be supportive, HR 7032, and I'm excited that we will be having a markup of this piece of legislation next week. Could you describe why it is CBO needs strong access to executive branch data? And perhaps you could give some examples of how delays in the past have impacted the work of CBO, ultimately impacting Congress getting the data it needs and the projections it needs.
Thank you. Thank you for the bill, which will help us greatly in supporting you. CBO is basically people, computers, and data. And think of data as information. And we use a wide array of information. Sometimes an agency in the executive branch has information that we need, and they're the only place we can get it. That the public information is just not detailed enough. So we work with agencies on that. We have 20 data agreements in place, and we do lots of work. There's sometimes legal questions from agencies about their authority to provide us with information.
So even if they want to provide the information, they pull back because they're afraid that they might be somehow violating existing law.
That's right. And I will give you the examples. You would ask for examples. I can give you one. So we've been doing work on the flood insurance program. And so we have some private sector data, but then we get information from FEMA. And FEMA's been very cooperative, but they've had concerns about their legal authority to provide us with information. We worked back and forth with them collaboratively. Your legislation would just solve that, would basically give FEMA the comfort that they're complying with the law without the kind of weeks of back and forth. So that's the sort of issue to solve. It would require us to have very strong security on these data, including at least as good security as and confidentiality protection as the agency that's providing us with the data.
Yeah. Can you, I think I know the answer to this, but I do think there's value in making this explicit. How does CBO protect data? And would any of the changes in the piece of legislation that I have with the chairman, the CBO Data Sharing Act, would anything in that bill impact CBO security practices?
If there's an impact, it would be to strengthen. But like I said, we follow the security protocols dictated by the agencies giving us the data. And so we have, an array of different ways that we secure the data. And then we have security precautions for the entire agency. So the legislation would require us to continue to do that. And we certainly would continue to do that.
Great. And then finally, just shifting gears, as you look, I referenced that approximately 270 employees at Congressional Budget Office. As you look at the responsibilities that Congress has placed on the Congressional Budget Office and the staff and budget that you have, how would you assess where you are right now in terms of having the resources you need to conduct your work?
So we've been shrinking since the December 2022 appropriations. We've not been filling vacancies, and it means I have vacancies in some key positions, like our Medicare cost estimates unit, which is one of our the busiest parts. We lost someone and can't replace them. We have someone very senior who works on the appropriations who's about to leave for a great opportunity. I can't replace him, and on. On the national security side, we've lost, one, and we're about to lose another. And things like the NDAA is now there's no off season on the NDAA for the amendment process.
Right.
So these are things if I had the budget, I would immediately hire in these areas and more. And it's really just to support you. We want to be responsive, and I'm worried that I don't have the resources to be responsive.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Swagel. And lastly, let me say, I know we talked about this last week, but tomorrow is the last day in a 2-decade congressional career of my friend, the gentleman from Buffalo, Mr. Higgins. So, Brian, I think I can say in a bipartisan way, we will all miss you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Now you'll back.
Well, let me say I associate myself with your comments about Mr. Higgins, and I have to put up with him not only on this committee, but on Ways and Means. So, but I'm glad to put up with him. He's a good guy, and he'll be missed, so we appreciate you, my friend. With that, thank you, Mr. Boyle. I'll yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Glenn Grothman.
Thank you. First of all, Director Swagel, I'd like to thank you for being here again. You guys always work so hard, and it's good you're able to spend today with us. Can you give us kind of an overview of the steps you've taken to increase transparency at CBO since you took over?
Yes, I'll give you a couple of steps that I've taken, and my predecessor also did a lot, so I've continued what he did. And some of it is, of course, meeting with you, testifying. We publish reports that provide background on our cost estimates. For example, our cost estimate of drug negotiation, we've published several reports providing the technical underpinnings of that. We publish reports comparing ourselves with other forecasters. We actually publish computer code as well on GitHub, so people can go in and see what we're doing. And then we request information as one other example. A recent one is we had a blog post on is anti-obesity medications, is like Ozempic and that kind of medication, asking for input to help us understand the budgetary consequences, including the health and scientific consequences. And we've had a tremendous amount of input from the private sector.
Okay. In April, you released a report describing, your creation of cost estimates. It stated, quote, CBO is currently developing a plan to make more of the account level analysis of appropriation bills publicly available in accessible formats. Can you give me an update as far as how's that going?
Wait, I'm sorry, say that last little bit.
Okay. You stated in an April report, CBO is currently developing a plan to make more of the account level analysis of appropriation bills publicly available. Can you tell us how that plan is going?
Oh, no, very good. Okay. So, no, thank you. And I know it's important to you on the appropriation side. So we have put on our website now, there is a tab on the cost estimate section that's for appropriations bills. Most of our cost estimates are about for authorizing committees and authorizing bills, but we do put out cost estimates on appropriations. So we now have a tab that collects all of that. And so we've been moving in that direction. There are other things we could be doing, and that I know you're interested in thinking about what more we can be doing.
Okay. There's a loophole in Section 402 of the Budget Act that carves out bills reported by the House or Senate Appropriation Committee from the requirement that you guys prepare cost estimates. Do you feel that provision prohibits you from providing account level analysis of appropriation bills?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
So we have the ability and authority to provide the account level information.
So you can. Is there any capacity restraint that would prevent you from publicly releasing account level analysis of those bills?
It is. That's really the barrier, is our capacity. Our appropriations team is, well, especially this year with what's happened with appropriations, has been pretty much nonstop. And so we would want to work with the budget committee, work with the appropriators to say, well, what can we do that suits your needs?
But you could release this stuff anyway.
Absolutely.
Okay. Later this week, I'll introduce legislation to provide an exemption from the Privacy Act. Can you discuss the current restrictions placed on the CBO by the Privacy Act in 1974 and how it hinders your ability to produce, or does it hinder your ability to produce accurate and timely cost estimates?
So that it's a similar question to what, in some ways, to what I answered with Mr. Boyle, that we think we have the authority to get information from executive branch agencies. They will sometimes point to the Privacy Act and say, well, even though the Budget Act says you can get it, the Privacy Act says maybe not. And so that, and this is GAO has more authority. They have
so good if we had a statutory change to make it clear, right?
Yeah. So that's legislation that we would certainly appreciate.
Okay. Can you describe the amount of time it takes CBO, or how much time CBO currently spends negotiating with the agencies to gain access to data that is covered by the Privacy Act? Is that a time-consuming thing for you guys?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll have to get back to you on the details of the Privacy Act. I'll tell you on negotiating with agencies in general. I mentioned FEMA. the Social Security Administration, we have 3 data agreements with them. One has expired, and we've been working with them for a year now to try to get it renewed. They keep extending our access, so it hasn't been a problem. But it's the kind of thing, it's like a year of sort of our general counsel's time has been, I think chewed up is the right word, trying to nail this down. So these sort of data access provisions would be very helpful.
Thank you again for testifying.
I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin. Yield 5 minutes now to our friend, Mr. Higgins from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Swagel, the new federal fiscal year begins October 1st of each year. And there's a process whereby federal agencies will submit requests to the Office of Budget and Management, which we'll use as a basis from which the president will make and advance a budget proposal to Congress. And then Congress begins its deliberations, passes a resolution in both the House and the Senate. Those budgets are reconciled toward the goal of trying to make a budget before or on October 1st of each and every year. How many of there's 12 appropriations bills. How many of those 12 appropriations bills have been acted in Congress for the fiscal year beginning October 1st of last year?
None so far.
Okay, how frequent an occurrence is that?
It's been a long time since those bills were enacted on schedule with the Budget Act.
Yeah. So in 2023, the federal budget was $6.1 trillion. It's approximately 24% of the entire U.S. economy. Do you believe that the American economy does not perform well when there is uncertainty and instability?
That's right. Uncertainty and instability has a drag on our economy.
Okay. So the federal budget each and every year, which doesn't get passed by Congress, and it's really one of 2 major functions that Congress has. One is budget and the other is oversight. Would you agree with that?
I would agree.
All right. So you can't recall the last time there was a budget that was enacted by Congress at the beginning of the fiscal year on October 5th or 1st, which included all the appropriations bills approved, which are necessary to have a budget. Otherwise, you don't have a budget.
Yeah, I don't know the last time that happened.
Okay. Well, here's my point. People beat up pretty good on the federal government. And it should be also, people should be reminded that the federal government is part of a public-private partnership. And, look at defense research appropriations, DARPA, for example. Every technology in everybody's smartphone here came from research that was financed by the federal government. Touchscreen technology, voice-activated personal assistant, global positioning satellite, and the internet. The same is true for drug development. Drug companies won't, do risky research because on the front end, the basic science of drug development is not profitable. It's all cost. And then the drug companies pick it up and they pay for it. I just want to make the point that the federal government is 24% of the U.S. economy. And Congress, that is responsible for developing a budget, fails in that responsibility every single year. Additionally, the United States is 5% of the world's population and 5% or 25% of the world's economy. So not only does Congress's inability to make a budget fully with approved appropriations bills virtually every single year, not only does it hurt the American economy, as the world's largest economy, it hurts the world economy as well. Would you care to comment on that?
No, I agree with you that, the kinds of instability and uncertainty that you pointed to in the U.S. economy has an effect on the rest of the world, and the economic prospects overseas affect us as well. So I agree with what you
Has
said.
that been quantified ever as a basis to admonish Congress to do a better job?
I haven't seen that, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone has quantified that effect.
So it's conceivable that it could be quantified.
It could be quantified.
I think that that would be a great public service
Yeah.
the Congressional Budget Office could provide to the United States Congress so as to admonish them to just do basically what Congress was put in place to do. With that, I'll yield back.
I would share with Mr. Higgins, I love his line of questioning. The Fitch and Moody's have quantified it. They've said that our lack of governing, our inability to come up with long-term solutions because of the dysfunction of our institution is a reason they have downgraded, which comes at a cost. So that's just one measure, but I appreciate your line of questioning. Now, for 5 minutes, our friend from Pennsylvania, Lloyd Smucker.
Thank you, Dr. Swagel. Good to see you. Let me start by recognizing the importance of the work of CBO to inform our decisions that we're making for policy and for legislation. And I appreciate the work that CBO does. Also appreciate you've made yourself available, your staff available to me multiple times on a variety of topics, and I appreciate that as well. And I think one of the things I'd like to drill down on just a little is this $1 trillion miss, because the work of CBO is important. We rely on CBO, and I think, wouldn't you agree, a $1 trillion miss can reduce our confidence in CBO's projections?
I agree. It was an extraordinarily large miss.
Yeah, and it really, your projections really do have an impact on how we're thinking about legislation and so on. So this is important to understand what happened here. And I appreciate as well, you provided an explanation. It looks like about roughly 1/3 was due to actions taken by the administration after you did your projection, right?
A big
Roughly
that's
1/3,
right.
about 300 some. So is that unusual?
It was an unusually large miss.
Well, I'm saying, is it unusual for the administration to take actions that are not authorized essentially by Congress?
It was unusual from our perspective. And,
Yes.
in some sense, we're trying to
I mean,
track it.
these were actions that you could not have been aware of, correct? Because
That's correct.
they were done unilaterally by the administration outside of the authority of Congress.
That's correct.
So I think it's important we get that on the record. This was extraordinary activity by the president in spending what we would allege were, he was unauthorized to do so, and this were outside of his authority. So that's number one. And then number two, I think about 1/3 of the projections where you just simply miss the economic projections.
That's right.
Why? Why would you have missed? I mean, that's a big miss. So can you tell us why you would have missed that in this particular time?
Yeah, so there's two pieces to it. And I'll talk about inflation, but the same thing applies to interest rates. And there it's what you said, it's just a miss, and it affects the revenues and outlays. The economy was changing rapidly at the beginning of 2022 when we were doing our forecast. And our process is that we have to do the economics before we do the budget. The analyst for unemployment insurance, she has to know, well, what's the unemployment rate going to be 7 years from now? So we have to do the forecast early. And when the economy is changing quickly, as it was in early 2022, even 2 months,
Sure.
doing a forecast 2 months early. So it's a mix of those.
And I wish we had more time, but I don't. I want to go back to something the chairman said. It does appear that other organizations like Penn Wharton were closer and perhaps have been closer in previous years as well on their economic projections. Do you track that?
We do. So we make comparisons to others,
So
including.
can you provide us with your comparisons on a number of organizations? I don't know the answer to this. I would be interested in knowing how you've done over the past few years compared to some of the other organizations. Just share that with the committee if you don't mind. When you look at that and you find if they are more accurate, I don't know if you'd agree if they are not, do you look at your own model? Because they're obviously, every organization is using different models. Do you think your model is still the best model after missing it by $1 trillion?
We do. We go back and look. When we miss, and on the inflation side, we went back and looked at, well, why did we miss? What did we miss? And our subsequent inflation forecasts have been not just much better, like really much better, like really spot on as inflation has come down over time. So we do go back and try to figure out, well, what do we need to improve?
Yeah. Have you made changes to your model after this year's $1 trillion difference?
We've, it's a in terms of the portfolio of models, we've made changes to, on the macro side, on the inflation side, again, in particular, where the miss was the biggest, we've made changes. We thought much more carefully about how the economy is changing as on the supply side, labor supply, supply chain disruptions, other things.
Again, I do appreciate your work. I've been asking some pointed questions. I just think it's really, really important that we all can continue to have confidence. So we appreciate your answers to these questions. Thank you.
I'm going to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania and yield to our friend, the gentlelady, Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First, let me just say to my friend and colleague, Brian Higgins, that I will definitely miss sitting next to you and hearing to the wisdom that you bring to this committee. We'll all miss that. Very recently, this committee marked up a bill to create a fiscal commission. I was on a fiscal commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission in 2012, and I have to tell you, as a consequence of that experience, I strongly objected to the idea of creating a fiscal commission, believing that the members of Congress are fully capable of coming up with budget decisions. And because they seem to focus on things like cutting Social Security and other benefit programs. What I'm interested in is what is the cost of a fiscal commission? This is not free, and I'm wondering, in addition to having members of Congress working on this, how much would a fiscal commission cost? What's your estimate?
So our estimate of the cost of the legislation was $12 million in discretionary spending, some for the operation of the commission, and then much of it for the public outreach campaign that was part of the legislation.
What is your view in terms of what it would cost? What kind of requirements would be made of you that would be of additional work if there were a fiscal commission?
So we would support the Congress and the commission. Depending on what else is happening, what other legislation we're working on, it could challenge us. And I mentioned some of the vacancies we have on the macro side. On our macroeconomic team, we have vacancies as well. On our Social Security team. So I'd want to make sure we had the resources really to support the commission wherever it went.
Okay, well, I think we should relieve you of that and just take care of it ourselves. Anyway, let me ask you about another issue. I am very concerned about income inequality in the United States. And Republicans have long claimed that cutting corporate taxes somehow is going to pay for itself. This has never really happened. We saw during the Trump administration a large tax, what I feel like is a tax giveaway to the wealthiest Americans. And I am just wondering, what was the cost of that Trump tax cut when he was president?
So we we put out a cost estimate at the time. It was before my time as director, so I don't have the number in my head. We did an analysis. I'll answer the question in this way. We did an analysis of the effects of it, and we said there would be economic effects on investment and some
Well,
revenue.
my understanding was that there was an estimate that there was a $1.1 trillion over 10 years would be the cost.
That sounds right.
Yeah, which is a heck of a lot of money. And so what I really would want to comment on your thoughts about the legislation that we're going to vote on today, and on the tax cut. And what we see is that for the child tax credit, that there would be $33 billion for the child tax credit, but $177 billion for the corporate tax cut. And we know that some of the companies, am I going up? No, I haven't. Some of the companies like Meta and Netflix and General Motors would actually have tax refunds as a consequence. I feel that that's inequitable, and I wanted to have your comments on what you think the impact will be.
Okay. So we haven't analyzed the specific tax bill that will be voted on today, just because that's the Joint Committee on Taxation has done that. We will, though. Every year we do a report on income inequality looking at the tax system. And so in the future, we will go back and look at the effect of how the tax system has changed and what that means for inequality, including the effects of the child tax credit in narrowing inequality. So we will get that. I just won't have that until after the fact.
I look forward to see your conclusions. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Illinois and yield 5 minutes to our good friend, General Jack Bergman, who's the chair of our Oversight Task Force. Mr. Bergman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Doctor, for being here. There's a current country song by Bailey Zimmerman. The title is Between a Rock and a Hard Place. And the first lyrics are, we've been swinging and missing. It ain't broke yet, but it damn sure needs fixing. We could probably apply that, but I would suggest to you, unlike the song, we're pretty broken right now in a few different areas. I'm going to focus my comments on, because as a member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, I want to discuss the CBO scoring of the VA-related bills in relation to the Toxic Exposure Fund, TEF. In short, the PACT Act allowed VA to use TEF for a wide variety of services for veterans exposed to toxins, shifting some traditionally discretionary costs like healthcare to mandatory spending. As a result, the CBO developed a rule of thumb scoring all veterans legislation, classifying a percentage of total discretionary costs as mandatory costs to any authorizing legislation which would affect one of 9 VA appropriations accounts. Okay, I know this is getting a little technical here, but some of this you may have to take for the record if you don't have it, but I'll stay with the big picture. The mandatory spending portion is currently 24% of the total authorizing legislation cost, and it is projected to increase to 42% by fiscal year 2032. This decision by CBO has forced the VA committee to find offsets to advance even the most basic bills, including several that I've introduced, and has greatly hindered our work in committee to improve the lives of veterans and their families. While I understand the statutory requirements for CBO under the PACT Act, it is essential that Toxic Exposure Fund related scoring by CBO is accurate and based on actual data. So my main question here is when, if ever, because you're kind of between a rock and a hard place here. It's kind of like you designed or you got involved with the FAA in figuring out how airplanes should work, but yet you never built them and you never fly them. So you're kind of somewhere out there because you've got to make sure of the safety of everything that works. When, if ever, will the CBO be able to dispense with its rule of thumb to assign a certain percentage of total cost as a mandatory cost for all affected legislation?
Okay, no, thank you. And everything you described is the way we do it. So when we looked at the TEF, we talked to the VA about how they would implement, as best they could tell us. And the rule of thumb was developed based on that and based on the data on the Gulf.
Now, I'm going to get to, because you could go on this and the rest of my time will be gone in a heartbeat. But the point is,
Yep.
you know it. Did the Congress not get the wording right in the legislation? Because we're looking in the mirror here, and we could have done better, because what the House did was good wording, but we ended up taking the Senate wording in the end game, and it created that loophole, or that created that uniquely soft area that puts us all between a rock and the hard place. And I'm not trying to lay blame on the Senate, but I think the House should have pushed back, and we have a chance to rectify this in the future. Is that fair?
That's fair, and we are ready to work with you and with the committee to think about different legislative approaches, so as to get out of the rock.
Yeah, because this is on us as the Congress, the House and Senate together working on this. Oh, by the way, as an aside, in the last 30 seconds, the $12 billion price tag for the Fiscal Commission, billboards and all that, I mean, where did that come from?
So we looked at past commissions that had a mandate to do public.
Do we have to do billboards just because, I mean, now we do digital as opposed to analog?
Right. So
that was an attempted humor. I know my time's about to run out.
Yeah. But instead of this is our process, is if there's something new, we say, well, what's an analog to it in the past? And so that's where the figure comes
Okay, so we're going to all help ourselves, whether it be here in the House under the chairman's leadership here on budget, or you as the CBO, and definitely our friends over on the north side of the Capitol, to do better and be more detailed in our guidance. With that, I yield back.
I thank the chairman, General Bergman. Now yield 5 minutes to our friend from Portland, Earl Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate you being here, Doctor. You take a step back and think about the complexity that you face. You have to operate under assumptions about how Congress operates. Very difficult. We've had conversations with your predecessors about how Congress could do a better job of present value accounting without going over the edge in terms of dynamic scoring. But that's the reality that you face, and the horizons that you have to deal with in terms of the interaction between the two bodies, the extraordinary set of circumstances that we face. I can see you being off $1 trillion. We were on a roller coaster 3 years ago in terms of the projections about how bad the economy was going to be. And there are some people on the other side of the aisle who had some pretty apocalyptic projections, and in the popular media. We keep talking about uncharted territory, and you were attempting to work that. But what's happened in the course of the last 18 months, we've seen the historic investments paying off. The GDP growth for the first 3 years, the Biden administration is 3.4%, outpacing the first 3 years of the prior administration. Inflation, which we were deeply concerned about, is now down to between 2 and 3%, very close to the Fed's target rate. We have almost 3 million jobs created last year. Unemployment is a historic low, 3.5%. I think it's been below 4% for 23 consecutive months. The work that we did, some of it was bipartisan. A lot of it was part of the work we did with the administration on things that were modestly controversial. but they appear to have been working. The landscape that you have now going forward appears to me to be much less uncertain than the historic efforts that we faced in the aftermath of the pandemic. So I am less concerned about attacking your modeling. I know you are 270 people. I mean, this is the smallest of the agencies, and you're doing a lot in uncertain areas. I'm wondering if, based on the success of policies recently, if that raises your confidence level in terms of the projections that are on the table now looking forward.
It does. I mean, the lower inflation gives us much more confidence that we've got it better, and that our projections, say on inflation, are more on target than what we had that I talked about in my testimony, and that affects revenues, it affects outlays.
Mr. Chairman, I just feel that we may have different opinions about the efficacy of policies, but I think they're working. I think the empirical evidence that CBO and other outside experts are looking at, that this is really extraordinary growth. We're doing better than any other major economy, and the minor economies as well. So it seems to me that it's important for us to focus on the big picture. We ought to focus on being able to help the CBO be able to have the resources to meet our needs, and that we need to have realistic expectations coming off the roller coaster that we've been on. A number of us have been through these challenges before. We've watched hits and misses, but I think we're in a trajectory now where we can have much greater certainty rather than sort of challenging the CBO, the assumptions. I would like to work to strengthen the agency to be able to focus on ways that they can meet our needs, and that we can have more realistic expectations for this impossible job that will never be done with complete accuracy in terms of projection. But we've got an agency that's doing a good job. We've seen the success of policies in place, and I think we ought to build on this degree of stability to be able to help CBO help us, and then we do our job, like collecting taxes that are owed and looking at areas of reform that we can agree on, which I think there's real potential for our moving forward.
I think the gentleman, and since you referenced me, I'd just say realistic expectations is a good thing for us to keep in mind, and I appreciate that. And it is complex and difficult. Constructive criticism, continual improvement, and expectation that we look at benchmarks and make sure that we are best in class and committed to excellence is also essential for our customers back home. But I appreciate Mr. Blumenauer, as he knows, and I'm going to yield 5 minutes to one of my best buddies who's also leaving this great and yet dysfunctional institution, Drew Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Swagel, first question to you. How does it feel to wake up every day, go to work, and feel like you're shooting rubber bands at the moon?
I'm here to support you. So that's my
Yeah,
mission.
well, we do it too. My point is you shoot rubber bands at the moon every single day, year in and year out, and you don't hit the target. You don't hit the target. So let's go back now. And when I say you, listen, I profoundly respect you. I think you're a smart guy. I think you're an honest guy. So when I say you, I could say y'all. I mean the entire CBO operation, past and present. If you go back, let's pick a number, 20 years, 25 years. Every time you give us a 10-year score, from that date forward to the 10-year mark, what's your accuracy? How accurate are you on day one when you tell us a program's going to cost $5 billion or $12 billion, and you get to year 10, what's your hit and miss rate?
It just
Yeah, just what's your hit and miss rate?
it varies so much. It's, yeah, I can't give you an overall because I can give you some quick examples on like where we've gotten it wrong, where we've gotten it right. But
No.
it varies so much.
What I'm looking for is that I want this body to understand, and we all want to understand the predictability that our friend from Oregon talked about. If you're going to give us a 10-year number, okay, and then we go out 10 years and we're not even in the ballpark, we're half of that number. That is, we're not making really sound decisions because the accuracy is so far off at the 10-year mark. I don't think that's a function of you not being able to do your job. I think that's a function of a really bad system. Static scoring. Why in the world are we not using dynamic scoring? Okay? Why in the world are we, a question that I'm going to submit to you in writing that I would like for you to answer is to look at every 10-year window that you give us on a score and then look at the accuracy rate at that 10-year mark. Okay? All right? Now, that's number one. Number two, because you're off, and again, when I say you, I'm talking about CBO. When CBO is off consistently, and I was on the budget committee in 2017, and I've kind of gone back and looked at what they said was going to happen in 2017, and here we are coming up on 8 years later, and we ain't even close. Okay, we're not even in the ballpark of it. All right, so we should be doing. Do you think that quarterly audits of your numbers, where they are, and some suggestions about how to make that better on a quarterly basis would be helpful?
It's something I've been thinking about. So every month, we put out the monthly budget review that provides information against the last year. You're thinking of this bigger picture, not like program by program, but the big picture is something I've committed to the chair to think about how we can provide you with more information, that you don't need to ask us, that we just push the information.
Okay, all right, that's good. All right, more information is helpful. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges is that every time y'all are wrong, which has been damn near every quarter that I've been up here, okay? Every quarter you're wrong. You always say why you're wrong to some degree. It's a little opaque, all right? Sometimes you make that clear as mud. But you never come back with a solution about how to fix that problem. And CBO hasn't offered meaningful solutions to us to consider. And if you're not going to do that, then maybe we're going to suggest those to you. But this is an absolute, if you think about where we are, since 1974, we got so many good men and women on both sides of the aisle that have run trying with the promise of getting our fiscal house in order, okay? To make sure we can take care of our most vulnerable, defend this nation, do all the things that we want to do as a great nation. And we're consistently off, consistently way off. And the result is trillions of dollars in debt, 36, 37 trillion now. We're not making real smart decisions because I don't think our information is really good, because you're operating by rules that don't lead to where we need to be. And it just begs the question, if we're going to continue, we're doing the same thing over and over again, and we're getting the absolutely same horrible results over and over again from the Congressional Budget Office. Mr. Chairman, I know my time is about to expire again. Director Swagel, I'm not trying to attack you directly. I'm trying to attack a process that is badly broken. And I look forward to Congress maybe making telling how we're going to reform this and do this the right way. I yield back.
I couldn't associate myself more with those comments, especially your conclusion. Before we lose our friend, Mr. Higgins, for the last time, I got a Yeti cooler here. The guys that created Yeti coolers are graduates of Texas Tech University, my alma mater. So it says Budget Committee. We appreciate this. Is best your Budget Committee colleagues could come up with was a Yeti cooler mug. And then I'm going to give you, as your friend, a Food, Fuel, and Fiber shirt. And so that's on behalf of the people from God's country in West Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Y'all give it up for Brian, please. You bet. Scott Peters, our friend from San Diego, 5 minutes.
Brian, you tell us if that Texas Tech mug holds water. Director, thanks so much. You know, you're an understated guy. I could be an understated guy. And I just want to call out what you said, which is you're not able to get people to fill these jobs. We depend so heavily on CBO. It is the sort of guidepost we use to have a common set of facts about what things cost. What do you need to have the capacity to solve these problems before we even talk about what the techniques or approaches would be?
So we're shrinking down under 270. I think I need about 285 people to really serve the Congress the way the Congress works now. If we had reconciliation every year, I need more. But
Okay, yeah.
But 285 in a kind of normal. I don't know what normal is, but
Do you have the money? Do you have the money for that, or is it an issue of you can't find people to take the jobs?
No, our budget, since December 2022, has been much lower than keeping up with inflation, and we're 90% people. Those are our costs.
So you need money.
So the only thing I can do to fit our budget
For 15 positions.
is shed people.
Okay, I'll just offer to the chair that maybe we ought to think about supporting that. This is sort of the backbone of. It's not a big expenditure, and we have to have people who have the capacity to do this work, even before we talk about critiquing the work itself. I also wanted to just thank you for meeting last year with researchers for Rady's Children's Hospital in San Diego to discuss California's Baby Bear project and how its findings might help inform your analysts' scoring assumptions. For those who don't know, Project Baby Bear used whole genome sequencing to diagnose a statistical sampling of our state's sickest infants. Over the course of the study, they found that immediately sequencing and diagnosing these babies prevented 513 unnecessary days in the hospital, 11 unnecessary major surgeries, and 16 invasive diagnostic tests. Even one day with your child in a neonatal intensive care unit can cost thousands of dollars. And early sequencing gave those families answers and saved an average of nearly $4,300 per patient by the time they left the hospital. Don't even think about lost earnings or all the other treatment that was avoided by that early detection. Now, that brings up the issue with the federal government scoring, because when we talk about things like screening and prevention, infrastructure, education, buying fuel for the military, we only talk about the impact to the budget this year, and we don't really account for the future benefits of that saving. So, that's something no family would do. You wouldn't say, I can save $10,000 on fixing the roof this year, knowing that when the storm comes through, you spend $30,000 on replacing your furniture next year. I mean, we have to figure out a way to handle that. And so I wonder, how do you propose we get a better job of, would you propose we would get a better job of accounting for the returns we get on the federal investments that we make, so we really are accurate about what things really cost over time?
No, thank you. And I've heard that from you and many of your colleagues, that we need to provide you with information beyond the 10-year window for exactly what you said. You help a child at age 2, well, at age 22, they'll have higher earnings, they'll pay taxes, and that applies to many things. And so we're working on that. For the budget, the sort of budget enforcement mechanisms, those are generally within the 10-year window. So that's our, our requirement, but we're working hard to figure out ways to provide you with that information over the 10-year window and out, as far as is useful to you.
Just so maybe flesh out a little bit, because we've been talking about this for a long time. How do you propose what do you think those tools are going to look like? Can you preview that for us?
Yeah, I'll tell you some of the challenges. One is just, $1 in year 22 is different than $1 in year 2. And so providing information, not just in nominal dollars, but in net present value. Right. So that's one. And finding a way to, that you don't need a finance PhD to, kind of understand what's going on. So that's one thing we're working on. Another one is the comprehensiveness. So there'll be benefits, improve a child's life, they pay taxes, but they're also going to draw on some benefits, whether health subsidies or other things, and try to get all of those pieces at all of the stages of their life. That's the kind of thing that is a challenge, but that we're working on.
Maybe with your predecessor, I talked about only tobacco was the only thing that had enough evidence to actually nail down future benefits avoiding tobacco. I'd suggest, we have a lot of evidence that may not be as extensive as that, but you could give us some benefit. You could discount it by 75 or by 50% for uncertainty. At least give us a chance to talk about things in a way that's realistic, in the way that's businesses and families do all the time. Mr. Chairman, I've exceeded my time. Appreciate the hearing, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, can I mention the two things that we're working on that I think are of general interest? One is obesity or anti-obesity, which has that long-run property. A second is hepatitis C, which also has that same, you help someone today, their life is better for 20 years. And so we're working hard on that, and I'll come back to you when we have more on that.
Great points about the time frame and how we measure the time horizon of benefits and ROI, and I think that's a really good topic. We could spend a whole hearing on, and these are things we're going to come back to, Dr. Swagel, for more of a deep dive. With that, 5 minutes to our friend from Utah, Mr. Blake Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. And to continue on that point, we could do a whole hearing on healthcare and those long-term factors, and it relates to what I wanted to talk about. But Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing on oversight. Regardless of who's in the administration, regardless of whatever Congress's majority or minority, we cannot be scared. We cannot be afraid to do our oversight responsibility. We don't exist as a separation of power, the congressional branch, unless, the congressional side of this, if we are unwilling to do that on the legislative side. And to the ranking member, thank you for always keeping to time on your remarks. Appreciate that. But I also appreciate your mentioning that, Democrats, if it's favorable, will highlight the CBO. They'll blast it on the other side, and Republicans will do the same thing. And we've got to be able to get away from that. We have to look at it, and that ultimately does go back to the CBO and your responsibility, Director. The accuracy and getting to that point where you've got accurate data that can extend over several years and looking forward. If we can have accuracy, then we will take more of a responsibility. I will commit to it, to make sure that we're delivering that, and even in our rhetoric and our tone, that we've got to look at a score, regardless if it's a Republican or Democratic-led bill, and recognize, okay, that's going to be accurate. So that has to exist back here. We cannot get ourselves in fiscal order if that doesn't exist. And the point I wanted to make is that net interest spending. So the numbers I have here, $217 billion for in 2023. It was several $100 billion higher than the CBO's May 2022 baseline projection. Okay, these are significant increases and extremely hard to predict going forward. It is my biggest concern. It's what keeps me up at night, knowing that when my kids have their first job and they just graduated from their, education program, whatever they're going to be doing, that they're going to have 40 cents on the dollar of whatever federal revenues are. It's just going to be our net interest. That's the part that keeps me up at night. Director Swagel, a lot of legislation proposals that are introduced have the significant long-term costs would be much larger if interest on the debt was factored in. Can you give us some perspective on the authority or ability at this moment to be able to project net interest costs associated with this scored legislation? Does CBO need an act of Congress to be able to make this more a part of the factor? Because as our net interest increases by hundreds of billions of dollars over year over year, every time you score, even if it's a small bill, will have a much more significant impact than it did in the previous decades. And that has to be something that we take into consideration. Can CBO enhance their efforts on this?
No, you've got it exactly right, that more debt, higher rates, we're more vulnerable to that. So we have the ability to do that for any legislation. What's the interest cost? What we've done so far is put up a spreadsheet on our website that has our interest rate projection, and anyone can do that. Say, okay, if a bill costs $10, well, here's the sequence of interest costs coming out of it. So we haven't put that into a cost estimate, but we've given everyone a tool that they can do that on their own.
And I would argue, and I would speak to our leadership, like, just having that on the website is great. I'm glad that it's accessible, but I think we need to move past just the theoretical conversation about it and move that into a more concrete element, because it is a concrete factor. Okay. And it is our nation's number one issue on the fiscal side, is what how much our net interest will continue to grow. And especially when you add in inflation, you add in interest rates taking a quick little hike, that's devastating to the entirety of the budget. I mean, we can predict Social Security, Medicare, Defense, Medicaid, the appropriations bills. We can predict their growth rate pretty accurately with the standard things that go on here. But that net interest is going to be a huge burden. With my remaining time, could you describe the collaborative process between CBO and JCT in developing fiscal projections? Do you share the methodologies and responsibilities and what lessons learned? I was fascinated to kind of come in, and I always want to find anything that's duplicative. Like, I want to just get rid of it out back here. Could you just share some of your comments on that?
Okay, I'll say 23 seconds worth, and happy to come and tell you more. So we're sister agencies. Anything that changes the tax code, they do. We stay out of their lane. So the bill today, that's being voted on today, there's a cost estimate that says CBO. Every number in there is from JCT.
From JCT.
By statute. Healthcare, the people and taxes are so woven together. We work collaboratively with them, and so that's just two examples of it. But it's, sort of statute by piece of legislation by legislation. We work collaboratively, but some things that are theirs, and we stay out of their lane.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Yield 5 minutes to our friend from California, Jimmy Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Director Swagel, for being here. Obviously, we appreciate your candidness and your honesty because we know that congressional scorekeeping can definitely be a pretty fraught topic on Capitol Hill. But you've always been a trusted resource, especially when it comes to our debt and deficits and the cost of legislation. And I think, as you heard today, and as you know, both sides of the aisle have taken issue with CBO's methods or particular scores from time to time, and often it's politically motivated, but other times there are legitimate criticisms of methods. Now, I'm glad that we're here today to discuss the CBO's role, examine where some of our differences lie, and see how we can achieve a common understanding of how CBO's models and scorekeeping work. More importantly, we need to get Congress closer to understanding the true costs of debt and deficits, of mandatory and discretionary spending, and the legislation that we bring before Congress. So thanks for being here today to talk about your process and how we might better understand and how we might better improve that process. Now, can you talk about the importance of interest rates to our debt and deficits? And pretty straightforward question, should Congress consider prioritizing deficit reduction when interest rates rise?
As the debt has risen, our vulnerability to higher interest rates has gone up. And by the same token, if there were credible deficit reduction, that would lead to a positive effect in terms of lower interest rates. So there's a virtuous circle to be had there.
Got it. Now, let me kind of hit on something that I think we're going to be seeing a lot, especially coming up with our vote tonight. The employee retention tax credit, I think, was something that obviously helped out during the pandemic, kept businesses afloat. Unfortunately, years after the pandemic closures, we've been bombarded with these ads. I think all of us have heard it in this room, telling small businesses to apply for a credit that they really, I think we've seen, don't need and likely aren't eligible for. Now, I'll note that we would end this credit early as a pay-for the tax credit deal that we passed out of Ways and Means, which raises $70 billion. And it appears that the ERTC alone contributed to both about $50 billion in outlays and an overestimate of $70 billion in revenues. Can you explain how this credit contributed to the overestimates and underestimates and how they impact your corrected projections?
So as you said, the ERTC was meant to support businesses, for the challenges they had in the pandemic. Businesses now can amend their tax filings from several years ago during the pandemic, and that's the activity that we see. In 2023, there's this, I think cottage industry is the right word, of the ads that you said, helping businesses do that amending, and then the IRS, it would be expected to send out checks in response.
Okay, great. Once again, thank you for being here. I appreciate your information, not just today, but as we go forward and continue to try to do our jobs. Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California. You have 5 minutes to our friend from Kansas, Ron Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Swagel, for being here today. We appreciate the time and all the Congressional Budget Office does to help facilitate the work we do here in Congress. But frankly, the CBO has fallen short in recent years on some of its work. And I hope that after today's conversation, you feel emboldened to actually address some of the needed changes to make sure that you continue to address and support Congress over the years to come. Obviously, CBO plays an important role in our lawmaking process. In order to address issues, members of Congress depend on organizations like CBO to assist in legislation. And accurate budgeting and economic analysis and accurate projections are essential tools that help us craft legislation and weigh how we vote. One of the key things that I always look at in terms of forecasting is making sure we have small variations between the forecasted amount and the actual amount. Whether the forecasting error, which there is some because it's difficult to do, but whether the error is on the high side or the low side, as long as it's a small variation between the actual and the forecasted, we'll have the best opportunity to have the best results. And with our debt the way it is now at $34 trillion, obviously that analysis is important. And with the debt increasing over the last year by over $2.6 trillion, it means we're now spending $85,000 each second that's being increased to the national debt. And it's not sustainable, and we've got to be able to make those spending decisions in that with the best information we have available. And so that's the focus that I want to talk a little bit about. One of the things was mentioned, and one of the things that's really important, and I want to highlight this here, is that when the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, was implemented, part of the discussion and part of the estimate was that there would be a loss in revenue. And the number, I think one of the numbers thrown around was about $1.5 trillion over the 10-year window. And just to highlight now, if I look at what the revenue projections that CBO made after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed versus what the revenue has come in from 2018 to 2023, actually we've already collected $1 trillion more than what was projected. And if the next 2 years before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts expire continues on at the same rate as the last couple of years, it will more than pay for that $1.5 trillion. So that's one of those things as we make decisions about tax cuts or about other things. I mean, something like this that shows that the Trump tax cuts paid for themselves over that time period from 2018 to 2025. We need that accurate information. And so one of the things I wanted to ask is, what kind of ideas are you looking at or plans that you're looking at to how to revise what CBO does to make sure that we have greater accuracy in budgeting or assessing key pieces of legislation? And how do we compare that with other models like Penn Wharton or the University of Chicago and their differences in projections?
No, thank you, and I agree with the importance of what you said. One key area that I'm pushing on is our ability to do dynamic analysis, to get those relationships between changes in tax policy and the economy, and then the feedbacks to revenue. We've done it in the past. We did it with the 2017 Tax Act, but we haven't, and we've done a few other little things, but I'm looking at what major legislation could we make sure that we're in position to do. And so tax is one, immigration is another, and obviously CBO has no opinion on what the right immigration legislation is, but I want to make sure that we're in position that if there is, we would be ready to say, what's the effect on the economy, what's the effect on, the dynamic effect for whatever legislation comes forward.
Yeah. What kind of comparison or analysis do you do today of actuals versus what you're forecasted? I mean, do you actually sit down at the end of the year or the end of the quarter and come back and look and say, well, this worked, this didn't, and how do we adjust that or tweak that and I know, kind of a scorecard yourself?
No, that's right. So we do that in two ways. One is on the account level, that generally twice or sometimes 3 times a year. Lately, it's been twice just as the press of business. Every analyst sits down with managers and with me, and we go through line by line, okay? SNAP benefits, it was higher and here's why, whatever, every line. So on the micro level, then we look at the overall. And so that's the $1 trillion miss. That came from our report at the end of last year, going at the big picture level of the miss that we had.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, and obviously it's an important issue. We want to make sure we get good, accurate information to help us make those decisions.
Absolutely.
I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Kansas, and now you have 5 minutes to Ms. Ballant from Vermont.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Doctor, I really appreciate you being here today. As you know, you and I had a rich conversation about the work of the CBO last year in my office, and I really appreciate the commitment that you have to evidence-based policymaking. That is the way we should be doing our work, always. So, one lesser known, I think, CBO function is the reports that you do on the effects of policies over the long term. And I'm keenly interested in the federal response to the opioid crisis. In Vermont, many of my neighbors, community members, and friends have tragically been impacted by the opioid crisis. And in 2022, we've already lost hundreds of people to drug overdoses. Drugs like xylazine and fentanyl are making the crisis so much worse. And have been working on this issue both here in Congress and also my time in the state legislature. And I know it's an issue that we actually have agreement on across the aisle. This is killing our constituents. It's killing the people who sent here to do work on their behalf. And it's critically important that the resources that we commit to this are actually doing a good job at combating this. So Congress has committed significant resources through the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act, the Substance Use Disorder Prevention that promotes opioid recovery and treatment, known as Support for Patients and Communities Act. And according to one study referenced in CBO's 22 report, the opioid crisis and recent federal policy responses, discretionary spending to combat the opioid crisis increased from $2.1 billion in fiscal year 2017 to $6.1 billion in fiscal year 2020. Your report stated, though, that opioid-involved deaths have continued to increase after federal laws on this issue were enacted. And initially, we had a slowing, but then it was preceded by years that we saw rapidly increase in deaths related to the pandemic. So clearly, our investments, while significant, haven't gone far enough or haven't been as effective as we need them to be. So can you just tell us a little bit about why it's so important to review the impact and efficacy of enacted legislation in charting a better path forward?
No, thank you. We are working hard on that, on looking at the impact of legislation and providing you with information on, this worked, this didn't seem to work. Not, never to tell you what to do, but to help you decide. And it's one of the shortcomings of that first report that you said that we couldn't evaluate what Congress had done just because it was too new.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're working on now. We're continuing to work on is a follow-up to that report with more evaluation. And some of it might be tentative, but if we can point you to say, here was the impact of this program and that program. We're not there yet, but I agree. It's essential for us to do it, and we're working hard on it.
Really appreciate that. And as I said, I know it's something, it doesn't matter what congressional district you represent. Every community is dealing with this. And it's really important for us to examine the work, make sure we're targeting the resources to the right places, figure out what's working and what's not. And I know that it is impacting families in every single town, county, and city in our country. We have to get beyond the partisan rhetoric around this. We really, really do. This is lives. I'm a former teacher, and the number of students that I have had that have been impacted by the opioid epidemic and their friends and their families. It's just absolutely devastating. The other thing I want to ask you about is the fact that, Congress really does have some power that we can leverage to reduce healthcare costs. And again, I think this is something both sides of the aisle can agree on. And doctors, there is a lack of competition in the healthcare sector, and it's driving up costs for Vermonters and for people across the nation. So I'm wondering, what do you see as federal legislation that can help combat exorbitant healthcare costs? And I know I'm almost out of time, but if you just point us in that direction again.
You bet, go ahead.
I'll give a quick response, and I'll come and bring the health team, and we'll tell you more.
Yeah.
It's an issue across so many aspects of the health system, and a challenge that the system is so complex, and there's so many sort of non-competitive aspects to it that there's not like one thing to do. And so there's a little bit of, we're looking at piece by piece, hospitals, pharma, other providers. And so I'll come back and
Appreciate that.
And bring.
Thank the gentlelady.
I yield back. Thank you.
You bet. Now yield 5 minutes to our friend from Indiana and the chair of the Budget Process Reform, Rudy Yakum, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to Dr. Swagel for being here today. For over 50 years, the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, has been tasked with providing objective, nonpartisan data and information to help support the federal budget process. Ensuring the accuracy of CBO's modeling, legislative scoring, and academic reports is essential to helping us as legislators make the best and most informed decisions possible. I believe that in some ways, the CBO has been successful in meeting those objectives, and in other ways, it has certainly fallen short. For example, the CBO's initial projection for drug price, quote, negotiation provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, estimated that only one less drug would come to the market in the 10 years following passage. But a year and a half later, we've already seen multiple treatments and cures pulled from the research pipeline due to these forced government negotiations. This includes potential treatments and cures for rare eye disorders and other cancers. Another area I'm deeply concerned about is the CBO's underestimation of the 2023 budget deficit projections by $1 trillion. In a time where federal spending is certainly out of control, we need to take meaningful steps to rein in our spending, and it's critical that we have accurate projections. Dr. Swagel, in your testimony, you addressed the various components that contributed to CBO's multi-trillion-dollar underestimation of our 2023 deficit. But briefly, what changes are you making to the model to ensure that these errors aren't repeated again next year?
No, thank you. So, I've looked at this carefully, and the pieces that the miss was entirely ours. That's what I've been focusing on. The things the administration did something. I don't think I could have reasonably predicted that. But like the inflation forecast, the interest rate forecast, that was we were off, and we worked hard to get that right.
So specific to my question, what changes are you making at this point in time to ensure that we get a more accurate forecast next year?
Yeah. So I looked carefully at, why did we get it wrong? Why we had high inflation, but inflation was much higher even than we said. So, why? What did we miss? And we missed, some aspects of what was happening on supply chains. And so we worked much harder. And then the interaction of the fiscal policy with the supply chain disruption, we missed some of that interaction. And so we've worked hard to get that better.
And you mentioned you're focused on the things that you can control, which I think is the appropriate steps to take. But you also mentioned things that the Biden administration did last year that exacerbated our deficit. Can you provide maybe an example or two of the single biggest things that the Biden administration did in terms of their executive orders of what you might call broad interpretation of legislation that contributed to last year's sky-high deficit?
Okay, and I'll mention maybe three quickly. One is on student loans, and there, we estimate current law, and when they take these actions, we tally them, we work with the Ed and Workforce Committee so they understand them, but it's going to be an error for us. Two is the the revenue delays from the disaster tax declaration, that's going to be a shift of timing. Revenues, instead of coming in 23, will come in 24. So as a miss for 23, we have to work hard to make sure we don't, get the same miss in the other direction. And then the last one is the corporate minimum tax. The administration, right, the law was enacted. The administration hasn't yet put out a guidance, so corporations haven't yet paid the money. It will show up, but again, it's going to show up in the future.
Thank you, Director Swagel. I'm a strong supporter of preventative health care measures, as they are essential to the long-term health of all Americans. And frequently, preventative health care bills score poorly given their higher upfront costs, and they don't necessarily take the long-term benefits into play. How is the CBO trying to adapt their models to accurately reflect the long-term savings of preventative health care?
Okay, no, very good. And it's something we're working hard on. We need to be able to understand the benefits in the future, including outside the 10-year window. And then, a challenge with the preventative care. So we're working hard on that. And so I mentioned Ozempic, the weight loss, anti-obesity. We're working hard to understand the cardiovascular benefits of those medications, as an example.
So the ability to look longer than 10 years for potential savings would be a benefit to the CBO.
That's an important piece of it. I'll mention one other piece, which it relates actually to what Mr. Peters had said with the hospital we talked to in San Diego, is the targeting. And they were working hard to say, well, which children need this genetic screening, sort of are the most, where it will have the biggest difference. And so that's also a piece. In some sense, with the obesity medication, how can policymakers target that at the people who will be sick in the future and therefore avoid the costs?
Thank you, Director Swagel. And Mr. Chairman, as Chair of the Budget Process Task Force Reform, we will be looking into that in terms of a longer window for the CBO.
Well, we appreciate your diligence on that front. And thank the gentleman from Indiana, Ms. Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Swagel, welcome. Just because our time is short, what is the singular major point that you look at when you score legislation?
For many things, it's how many people are affected and what's the cost or savings per person. And so a lot of times that's what it boils down to, is the sort of P times Q.
So you want to look at really benefit to the American people, ultimately.
We try to provide information on that. We focus on the cost, and then sometimes the cost and the benefit are just, they can be the same, but they can also be separate. So we try to provide you with information on the benefits, but our mission really is focused on the costs.
And I think you did an analysis of the Trump tax cuts. Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that analysis showed that they did not pay for themselves. In fact, the Tax Act was estimated to increase the deficit by more than $1 trillion over 10 years. Is that accurate?
That's correct, yes.
And how did you assess that impact, negative impact?
Okay, so I'll just say briefly, first of all, we worked with the Joint Committee on Taxation, which does the estimates of tax legislation. We looked at the effects of the tax cut on businesses, on households, and then the effect from there to the economy, and then back to revenue. And so we said there'd be a positive impact on some businesses and some households, but not enough to fully pay for the.
And I think that is important to put on the record. They did not pay for themselves. Mm-hmm. On the Biden, one of my colleagues just asked about Biden proposals that impacted the economy. Mm-hmm. Student loans, wouldn't that give more fluidity in one's income as one of the student loan recipients, if you will, and to benefit from that reduction? Wouldn't that counter any impact on the economy, for there to be more cash flow in their pockets used in the economy?
Yes, that's exactly right. That those actions, we tally the cost. We also try to say, well, what's the impact on consumer spending, on households, and so on.
So student loan reduction might, in fact, generate an impact in the economy for the use of more cash in their pockets.
That's right.
So if we had to make an analysis of going further, this is just me speaking, I might look at that as a positive step to go forward to help that generation that seems to be plagued with one student loan after another, because that's what I'd like to see happen.
Oh, I see. No, that's right. And the forgiveness, as you said, would affect certain generations, younger rather than older. That's right.
Let's take a journey down a racial equity road and give us a sense, in particular, of the numbers that we find in people of color, and particularly African Americans. I think they have made at least some progress under the Biden administration on unemployment. But it is not in housing, healthcare. And so have you taken a look, since we serve a very broad, diverse nation, the issues that we are confronting with racial inequity?
Yes. If it's okay, can I mention 3 ways that we are trying to meet that
Yes, and
that need for
I
information?
think we spoke before of the HR 40 concept of reparations.
Reparations, right. And I apologize, we haven't analyzed that. But on healthcare that you mentioned, we have been working to make it so that we can analyze health insurance and coverage by breaking it down by race. That, as you said, there's great inequality, by different dimensions, and one of them is race. We haven't been able to analyze that. We're getting close, and so we'll be able to do that. The same on tax policy. There's a slideshow on our website from some of our analysts. We've been working with the Census Bureau to be able to relate tax information by race, which, of course, you don't put your race on your tax, on your 1040, but we've been trying to make it so that we could at least say something. And then the last one we're doing is flood insurance. And this is Representative Waters has been instructing us to do this, is to say, well, what's the effect of flooding by different communities, not just by location, but by race? And so we've been working hard on that as well.
Well, can I ask you to add, again, my discussion on HR 40 is to raise that as an analysis that speaks to the historical record of African Americans and how that trajectory impacts their economic status even today. And that would cover, I think I'd like to have you emphasize housing affordability, housing access, which is everyone's pathway to wealth. Ownership of property and or in the form of housing is a door opener to wealth.
Okay, no. And I understand that. So as these past inequities play out today on household wealth, so the inequalities of the past and the injustices of the past affect the families of today. So we're not working on it now. If we had the ability to, I agree, we need to work on that.
I thank the gentlelady.
Thank you. I yield back.
And now yield 5 minutes to my friend from the Palmetto State, Ralph Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Swagel, for coming. You've heard it over and over again, the accuracy of what your reporting has been. Would you agree spending is the cancer in this country? Overspending?
Overspending presents economic difficulties.
All right, let me just give you a rundown. In May of 22, the projected outlay was 5.9 trillion. In 23, the actual from the CBO was 6.5. Net interest spending was 217 billion higher than projected. Higher education, 143 billion higher than projected by the CBO. FDIC, 99 billion higher than projected. SNAP, 18 billion higher than projected. Now, I'm in the real estate business. If you and your family were starting a business and I consistently gave you figures that were much higher that you had to get a loan for, would you keep me on board? And as I heard one of my friends from the other side, said what you needed. I mean, it's costing us taxpayers to fund the CBO $63 million a year. You've got 275 employees. Would you tell me that you needed more? If I were the scenario I presented you, would you want to give me more money to put bad figures in front of you?
Well, I'd say 2 things. One is I'd want to know, well, what was it? What went wrong? And that's what I tried to explain some of that in my testimony. And then two is I'd say, well, with the additional funds, what would you do? Would it make it better? Would we get more of the same?
But you'd be pretty mad, wouldn't you, if I gave you bad figures consistently?
I mean, well, you can see I don't get mad easily, so I wouldn't get mad, but
Well, let me ask you
I'd get
this.
curious.
Who is your boss? Do you do a customer survey? Do you get with them? Who do you answer to, in your opinion?
So we answer to you. I mean, we work through the budget committees, but we work for all the committees of jurisdiction. And so we work in substance in both of those levels. And so for on health legislation, our boss would be the committees that work on health legislation.
Well, I think you would get, if you didn't get mad, if it were coming out of your pocket, you would get mad, because I would, you just can't reward bad behavior. On what method of estimating cost of the federal credit programs would be the most comprehensive for assessing the market-based risk?
That's right. The market-based risk would provide a comprehensive assessment. And for example, student loans, we don't have that in there because by statute we're required, we're directed not to put that in there.
Is it fair value?
Fair value would do it. Would give you the most comprehensive assessment of risk.
Okay. On the Fair Credit Reporting Act, FCRA, give me your take on that.
It's something we evaluate when it has budgetary consequences, and it's a balancing act between protecting consumers and affecting the flow of credit and what that means to consumers who don't have access to credit.
And how about describe the green energy loan programs and the costs on the FCRA fair value analysis?
So the green tax credit programs, the challenge there is that, well, first of all, those are JCT numbers that we then update. Right. The market has evolved quickly, and the administration has implemented those programs in ways that were more expansive than I think JCT had put into their estimate. So next week, with the economic outlook, we'll have more details. They're going to be substantially more expensive than the Joint Committee on Taxation originally estimated.
Let me just suggest to you from our side, you've kept hearing it, we've got to get accurate figures. And heads need to roll in your department. I don't think you need more money. The 270 employees, the $63 million we're paying the CBO to get numbers that never match up, particularly on the spending level, is atrocious. And all I would ask you to do is, whoever your boss is that you consider, and whoever under you is giving you bad numbers, they need to do the job, and we need to get numbers that are accurate. The things that come up that I hear now with the CBO, we basically just start laughing because we don't believe the numbers. Thank you for coming and appreciate your time. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from South Carolina. Now yield 5 minutes to our friend from Michigan, Ann Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Swagel, for being here. I've been around a long time. There's still two things that are mysteries to me.
Yeah, he would.
Pro wrestling and CBO scoring.
Who's your boss?
So if you can help me figure out either one of those, I think we'll be moving in the right direction. But I think we equally sometimes share a curiosity about how some of the conclusions are drawn. I would understand that some of your challenges when policy decisions are made after your analysis is done, that it's obviously going to affect the outcome. But I do want to focus on a particular question, and that has to do with what I refer to as legacy industrial cities. I come from Flint, Michigan. I was the county treasurer back home. Much of my career before Congress was focused on the condition of older industrial cities. I represent Saginaw, Flint, Bay City, communities that have great legacies but have difficult current conditions, but are starting to see some renaissance as a result of some of the work that we've done here in Congress. The bipartisan infrastructure law making a difference. CHIPS and Science Act seeing us reshore manufacturing and investing in new technology that delivers really good jobs. My curiosity is that these investments I've seen firsthand, the impact they can have on those older industrial legacy communities in terms of their ability to not be a drain on the national fisc, but actually contribute to a more stable economy and a more stable budget outlook for the country. And I'm curious as to the extent that
the CBO is able to analyze those sorts of investments and looking at the all-in effect of those sorts of investments on those communities and ultimately on their contribution to our economic and fiscal situation. So if you could just discuss momentarily the research CBO has done on the impact of federal policymaking on employment, on economic growth in these most distressed communities, and then what additional resources or technical capabilities you would need if we were able to expand that work.
Okay. And I'll start by saying we do some, but not a lot and not enough. And so I'm grateful to this for pointing me to it as something that we need to focus on more. And in the future, we will go back and look at the effect of the infrastructure bill and the CHIPS bill. And I know that these regional effects are going to be an important part of the story of those bills. So we'll get there in the future. We've done a little bit of it in the past. And so as an example, some of the provisions in the Build Back Better legislation that we scored when it was voted on in the House had a regional aspect. And so say childcare subsidies or preschool subsidies, we called state by state to talk to them to figure out, okay, are you going to take up the program? What would you do? And then we added that up, and that was our estimate. So that sort of thing a little bit, but not, really not the big picture issues that you're focused on. And so I can only apologize, and we got to do better.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think one of the other aspects of your work that I just want to call out and see if you might comment on, I've long been of the view that the window over which we examine the efficacy of our investment decisions, whether it's tax policy or investments in, say, early childhood education, since you referenced it, the 10-year window is interesting. I think it might be the wrong 10-year window. If you think about the impact of early childhood education, there's often criticism of programs like Head Start, for example. Looking at the next 10 years for a 3-year-old is interesting. Looking at the 10 years from age 13 to 23, or the 10 years from age 23 to 33, is where that investment bears its greatest fruit. Do we ever look at that? Do we ever supply data on those longer term impacts?
No, okay, no, and I agree with that, everything you said. We've started. So we have a project that so far we've put out one paper on to look at investments in children is what we think of it as, that if you provide healthcare to a child, including in utero, what does it do to their long-term trajectory? And like you said, age 23, 33 and on. And so we've looked at that, what's the additional revenue that's spun off, and then how does that compare to the cost? And so we'll get you that. But that, in some sense, that's the proof of concept, and I want to make sure that we're ready to provide you information on future legislation that has that property, that kind of long-term benefits.
I appreciate that. That's very helpful. And in the remaining 10 seconds, anything at all on pro wrestling?
I have a former student who's a pro wrestler.
You do?
He
Right.
briefly played for the Dolphins and then went into pro wrestling. So I will hook you up. No.
Thank you very much.
We have such broad authority here that I'm not surprised when anything, including pro wrestling, comes up. Thank you, Mr. Kildee. And now yield 5 minutes to our friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Yes, ma'am.
Just procedural.
Yes.
Just procedural. Thank you so very much.
Yeah.
In the Financial Commission markup, I'd like to place on the record at the appropriate place my vote for aye for our ranking members amendment and the Jackson Lee amendment. I was unavoidably detained, and so I'd like the record to reflect I would have voted aye for those two amendments.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank you. I yield
Thank
back.
you.
Thank you for coming before us. The CBO has a unique relationship to the Budget Committee. As was mentioned by the chairman, the lack of true oversight by this committee for a number of years has been lacking, and I appreciate the committee actually taking our responsibility seriously. Many of us came to get our spending issues under control. That is inclusive of both revenue and the spend. And I appreciate the fact that there's an attempt made to get accurate numbers. I'm concerned that maybe there's some mission creep that has occurred. You heard the statement, jack of all trades, master of none. And so I want to kind of talk about the dabbling by the CBO in areas that maybe stealing the intellectual heft to focus on the things that are the priorities and the original reason, the original mission. According to the CBO report titled CBO's Recent Publications and Work in Progress as of December 31st, 2023, there were several items of concern, for me, concern about how you guys are moving into the climate hysteria realm. And so I'll quote from the CBO's drafting report. You were evaluating the effects of climate change on markets for property and casualty insurance. You were summarizing the risk that climate changes pose for the budget and the economy. CBO spent countless hours and resources publishing reports titled, quote, Carbon Capture Storage in the United States. I can't see how that has anything to do with the budget. Emissions of carbon dioxide in the electric power sector. Again, how does that relate to core mission? Emissions of carbon dioxide in the transportation sector. So mission creep, absolutely, to me, is clear in this. And the intellectual heft borrowing of assigning staff to work on that type of activity when we're missing projections in the $1 trillion range. And so I'd just like for you to, put your bipartisan, straight reasoning. What's the mission of CBO? Why are we getting involved in this?
Okay, no, thank you, and thank you. This is something that started with me as director, is this quarterly report and what we're working on. So, thank you for mentioning it. We do have a pretty robust work program on climate, and you mentioned some of it. And so there's two pieces to it. One is that, I'll say the two pieces and say why we got there. I'll be fast. It's to say, if there is eventual climate legislation, we want to be ready for it. And so that's why we're looking at the transportation sector, we're looking at manufacturing, electric power generation, the places where, the Biden administration and others have just focused on as potential legislation. And of course, we have no view on what the right thing is. I want to make sure we're ready to estimate it. And so that's a big piece of it. And then second, we respond to members. If a chair or a ranking member of a committee has jurisdiction, wants a report on something, and I can do it, we're going to do it. And so some of the reports that you mentioned were, directed. We were directed to do it, and so we're responding to congressional interest.
But is the CBO the proper placement for those requests? Is there not GAO, Congressional Research Service? It's the better placement when they're asking you to analyze the amount of storage capacity for carbon in the United States. Again, staff devoted to that, when it could go to CRS or GAO, that steals from the time and placement of getting the numbers correct that this committee absolutely has to have to make, the biggest decision Congress is tasked with, which is power of the purse.
No, that's right, and that's part of the management challenge, is allocating resources. And there is substantial congressional interest in the topic, and that's why we have these people working on it.
Do you have the ability to say, we're not the proper entity for this? This needs to go to CRS. This needs to go to GAO.
There's some things that does happen. Especially something backward-looking, evaluate past legislation. GAO, has many more people, so we do it sometimes.
How many staff are? 9 seconds. I apologize for interrupting you.
Sorry.
How many staff are associated with anything in this realm? How many total staff do you have associated in this realm?
It could be a dozen, 8. There's a dozen working in micro.
So 12 people at approximately $100,000 salaries. That's real numbers.
I'm including people who work on lots of different things, because like our financial modelers would help with our flood insurance, for example. So there's a core group that's 4 or 5, and then there's 6 to 10 to 8 others who contribute in various ways.
Just to yield with this, Mr. Chairman, appreciate your indulgence. We're missing it by miles in terms of our projections. This is a new initiative. Maybe there's a correlation with that yield.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma and yield to my dear friend from the great state of Texas, Mr. Chip Roy, for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Dr. Swagel, great to have you here. Appreciate your service. And I've just got a couple of different questions. The first question is, I want to make sure that I have my facts right because, and we visited about this, and I appreciate your willingness to visit with staff and offices at a moment's notice. And I will say that you guys are great and responsive, and we appreciate that. Recently, you all found, and I believe put out a letter to this effect, that a full year continuing resolution under the statutory caps that were in the Fiscal Responsibility Act from last year that were passed on a bipartisan basis with majority votes by Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate, that doing so would decrease non-defense discretionary spending by $73 billion while holding defense spending and veterans spending harmless, i.e. flat. Is that roughly correct?
Yes, that's correct. And you can see that at the bottom of our cost estimate for for each of these continuing resolutions.
And so it is fair to say, without you opining on the merits, obviously substantively in terms of the legislation or the political decisions we have to make, that passing of a continuing resolution, a full year CR, that would basically come in somewhere around the $1.564 trillion level, roughly, that would be significantly lower than the $1.59 trillion cap in the FRA. It would be lower, and the significantly lower than the current appropriations deal on the table, which adds in additional, again, whatever merit there is for doing so, or lack of merit, that the additional spending that would come in at $1.66 trillion, right? So the point is, just a simple matter of fact, a continuing resolution passed right now, a full year continuing resolution worded appropriately that talks about it being a full year appropriation would save the American people about, give or take, $100 billion, or a significant amount of savings, give or take, off of the deal currently being negotiated at roughly $1.66 trillion and significantly less than even the 1.59 levels at the top levels of the caps. Am I roughly articulating that correctly?
Yes. If it's okay, I want to add just one. So yes. Period. One note is that the bill, or the legislation now being negotiated, obviously we haven't evaluated yet.
Correct.
So I can't speak to that. But as a broad matter, you've got it.
To the extent that news accounts are suggesting that it would be at the 1.59 plus some additional spending based on whatever side agreements were reached, there would be a materially lower spending level if we simply, as a body, passed CR that adheres to the caps that this body passed by majority votes by House Republicans, House Democrats, and the Senate passed by majority House Republicans. Literally, we will save the American people $100 billion by adhering to law that was enacted, signed by the President of the United States. I just want everybody to know that as these quote-unquote deals are being discussed. Second question is, you and I have discussed, and again, I appreciate your all's office attentiveness and responsiveness. We struggle as a body to get what I would say accurate dynamic scoring on bills when we get out of the kind of typical static scoring that we do here. And when you've got something, for example, I've got bills, a lot of my colleagues have bills on health savings accounts and what I might call healthcare freedom, ways to massively empower individuals with dollars that go to them, give them the tax break that we are largely giving to corporate America, or rejigger how we handle the tax breaks for corporate America, that those can go into savings accounts instead of being, paying for the, health insurance premiums. And we've got to find a way, and I just want to say this in a public setting. So again, I want to give you credit. We've had good conversations about all these kinds of things. It's important to say in a public setting how CBO can be responsive going forward, and what can Congress do and what can this committee do to get CBO to have the tools necessary. And that might be budget, and my friend was talking about your budget and what your staff looks like, or outside groups or whatever. We've got to be able to do that, to be able to take into account, and I just wanted to hear your comments on it, the dynamic impact of driving prices down by having transparency. You don't have to comment on the policy of it, but to be able to assess what that impact would be if we do that, right? No one knows, but yet we get told, oh, that'll cost $1 trillion. So then it's dead on arrival, but we can never have a creative way to approach making sure that American people have doctors and, can go to the doctors of their choice and have choice. Instead, we're stuck with, that'll cost $1 trillion. And I'm not faulting you, I think, but I'm faulting this very broken system. We've got to find a way to break that. So I just wonder if you have any comments on what that might look like besides what I know would be an easy answer, which is more staffing, which I get, but could you comment on that? And then I'll yield back.
Okay. And you've hit on not just my goal, but my mission to be responsive and to be transparent, to respond to your interest in this legislation. I know many others have the same interest, and to do it in a way that you can understand. If you agree or disagree, at least we'll understand what the differences are. On something like this, the kind of change to the tax benefits in the healthcare system, we would work with the Joint Committee on Taxation, so it would depend on their capacity as well. But we have the ability. It's just the health committees, boy, they keep us busy, basically full time, and so we're just constantly struggling to get the water.
We call that a hamster wheel, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. I can get the water level to here instead of here, but we absolutely have the ability. It's just the time and the.
I think the good director, I think the gentleman from Texas, and I know there's a longer conversation about a lot of these things. I appreciate those comments. And now yield to another great Texan from our Healthcare Task Force Chair, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington. And Director Swagel, thank you for participating in the roundtable that we did in the Budget Task Force. I thought it was particularly revealing. We had a former CBO director, Doug Holtz-Eakin. We had someone from the investor class, someone from the inventor class to talk to us about the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act on basically delivering the cures for the future. I think we had a pretty good discussion. And then the plus side of all of that is, because of some discussions that you and the chairman and I had, you've opened up a portal on the CBO website, allowing stakeholders to submit research and data that they have regarding the reality of drug innovation. So I'm grateful that this request was received and granted. I have a letter that I want to introduce to the record, Chairman Arrington, responding to the CBO's call for research in the area of drug development. This letter is signed by more than 350 biotech investors and innovators representing $309 billion.
Without objection, so ordered.
So, Director Swagel, I appreciate your cooperation over the last few months as the task force has engaged with you and your staff about the accuracy of your models. What has the CBO generally, and you specifically, learned from those conversations facilitated by the task force stakeholders?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you again for having us participate and putting us together with these outside groups. And we've continued to engage with them. So the letter, it's shown up in my social media feeds, and I've read it. Our analyst working on this has read it. And there's some things in there which, I wish they would do a little bit more to understand what we're doing. But there's some things where we're like, oh yeah, they're right. We need to do it differently. And so we're continuing to work on our modeling of the effect of negotiation on innovation. And we're going to implement some of what is in the letter, as I understand it, is in the letter. So I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate that response. Mr. Yacom's discussion about preventive health and the 10-year window that came up from Mr. Kildee. And we are going to have an opportunity next week, I think, to mark up a bill for the preventive health savings. Particularly germane. It's always been germane. I've been working on this for 20 years. It's always been germane. But really, the introduction of the new anti-obesity medications has kind of changed the equation. Of course, you've got Medicare that says we're not paying for any of that. You've got the Joint Economic Committee that says current obesity rates are responsible for a 2.5% reduction in the aggregate labor supply. And that's a 2% reduction in the level of real GDP. From 2024 to 2033, this labor supply reduction is a potential GDP loss of $5.6 trillion and a $1 trillion reduction in federal income tax receipts. So that's pretty significant. Are you assessing how the anti-obesity medication coverage could affect the federal budget with the broader economic factors that the CBO needs to take into account?
Yes, sir, we are. We're doing it both for anti-obesity and the related issue of hepatitis C, which has some similarities
Sure.
and some differences. And there's actually, it's important development. The FDA is considering adding a cardiovascular indication for the anti-obesity medications. In some sense, that would change current law. If they do that, then Medicare presumably would cover those indications, and some of the costs of additional, broadening coverage for anti-obesity medications, in some sense, would move into the baseline, right? As a society, we'd still pay it, but it would be attributed to the baseline and not to any legislation. So that's a development that we're tracking carefully, and we would update our analysis once that happens.
Great. I really appreciate your office is putting out the budgetary effect of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. It's been a burr under my saddle for a long time. I never expected that CMMI was actually going to deliver the cost savings that was promised. And you weren't there when CBO scored the Affordable Care Act in 2010, but there was a big deliverable that CMMI was going to deliver, and I was never successful in bringing legislation to repeal the CMMI part of the ACA because, oh, look, it would cost money because it's we've already booked the savings that they're going to deliver for us. And of course, in your report, we at least I kind of get the inkling that those savings never actually materialized, and in fact, there may be an increase in spending. So I just want to point out to you that absent the CMMI, it's not like there is not any oversight over to the quality of some of the things that go in at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, because in a bill signed by President Obama in 2015, the Physicians Technical Advisory Commission was created. It has existed now for almost 10 years. It has been populated. A couple of the folks have resigned and discussed because they were not listened to by HHS. And I hope you would work with me to explore how, if CMMI is not working out, perhaps the Physicians Technical Advisory Commission, which is already established in law in the macro legislation, how we could use that to, in fact, achieve some of the savings models that were supposed to be achieved in CMMI.
Okay. No, you have that commitment. You were right on CMMI. We finally acknowledge it.
Wait, say that again. Say it for the people who weren't
The
paying
record
attention.
will reflect, so ordered. I approve, hear ye.
It
I was
took a
right.
while, but we put it out. But seriously, I look forward to working with you on the the other advisory committee.
Can I get you to call my wife and tell her that I was right?
Dr. Swagel, thank you.
Thank you.
And Dr. Burgess, that exchange is an example of why you're an institution and a great asset for the conference, our Congress, and the American people on the issues of healthcare policy. Thankfully, we've got healthcare policy leaders like the gentleman to your left who limped on into the committee today, literally. Buddy Carter, the gentleman from Georgia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director, for being here. I appreciate it. Let's start with this. Let's start with timely and responsive scoring. There's been a lot of discussion and concern among members of the committees regarding the amount of time it's taking CBO to score these bills. And because as you know, and it's no secret, everybody here knows that the CBO score is very important. We pay attention to it, regardless of how many instances we might be able to point out where you were grossly wrong, we still depend on it. And I think you understand that. And look, I'm being practical here. I know that in the 118th Congress that we're in right now, we've had over 7,000 bills introduced. I know that's a heavy lift. I know that's a lot of work. So I'm not trying to be impractical, but, and I suspect most of them need CBO scores. I don't know what percentage of them, but I would suspect it's the vast majority of them that need a CBO score. So again, I understand it's a heavy lift, but I've got a bill. It's a bipartisan bill, H.R. 1770, the Equitable Community Access to Pharmacist Services, that was introduced in March of 2023. It's my understanding that the bill was sent to CBO for scoring in June by committee staff, yet we still don't have a score. Is it unreasonable for members of Congress to think that 7 months is not enough time to come up with a score for something like this?
No, you've put your finger on one of the challenges I face, is that, right, the bill would recognize that pharmacists provide healthcare services and are a key way that people get healthcare provided to
You
them.
do also realize that pharmacists are the most accessible healthcare professionals in America. 95% of all Americans live within 5 miles of a pharmacy. All of us, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, want the same thing when it comes to healthcare: accessible, affordable, quality healthcare.
No, that's right. And the challenge I face is that the committees with jurisdiction over Medicare, their workload has been so heavy that, they would never say to us, and we would never listen, don't do that bill, but they'll have other priorities, and I have to do what where the committee is going first. That's what I have to do first. So I can only apologize that we haven't been able to do it yet. And I agree with you.
Can you commit to me that you'll come up with a score for me soon?
Let me come back to you on that. I can't give you that commitment now, but I'll come back to you.
Well, and it was kind of my next question, and that is, how do you determine which ones move to the top of the stack? I mean, what determines that? Just the amount of pressure you get?
It's really, we work with the committee staff, and so that means the chair and the ranking member of the committee will set our priorities. And then, we work, of course, with leadership in both chambers to say, well, what's going to the floor of the chamber, and then that, and then everything else comes after those two priorities.
All right. Well, look, I need help on this one. Okay, I'm a subcommittee chair, but I'm not a committee chair, so I'm sure I don't carry as much influence as the committee chair does. But we need this. 4% of all independent retail pharmacies are closing every year. That's going to impact the accessibility of healthcare here in America. And again, all of us want accessible, affordable, quality health care. Let's move on. In December of 2023, your office published a report on the accuracy of your projections for the fiscal year 2023. Is that a statutory requirement? Is that something you have to do?
That particular report is not required, but we do it as a transparency exercise.
What kind of methodology did you use in determining whether to make it a public report? I mean, what inspired you to make it a public report?
I mean, anything that reflects on whether we get it right or wrong, I want the public to see that. And this one, we got it way wrong.
Right.
It's $1 trillion, and that's, I want that out there. I want people to be reacting.
Would you be supportive of a law that required it?
Wait, I'm sorry, say that again?
Would you be supportive of a law that required you to have that report, to publish that report every year?
Oh, I mean, like I said, it's not needed, but whatever the Congress thinks is the way we can support them.
I'm going to take that as a yes, okay? All right. One final question, if I could get it in. Panel of advisors. I know that that's important. But in your website, you say members of this panel generally serve 2-year terms and are sometimes reappointed, but that's kind of vague. Tell me, who appoints these members and these boards, and how do you ensure bipartisanship?
No, so they're appointed by me as director. Most of them, or many of them, were on the panel when I arrived. It's a very distinguished group.
Are they compensated?
It's like $500 a year. So it's and the travel to
that would be a no.
I mean, it's virtually no. I mean, it's yeah. And it's bipartisan. So we have members. We have people who worked in the Trump administration, Obama, Bush, Clinton.
Does anybody check you on this, or
we do?
Do you submit them to the committee? I
mean, they're on our website. So it's public. The meetings, we have 2 meetings a year, and congressional staff attend the meetings.
Well, one of the reasons for this hearing is to see how we can do better in helping you. And when we do want to help you, and perhaps there should be a process where you submit names and the committee approves them. Or, that would keep you from, whoever is in that position, it would keep them from criticism and make sure that we were getting bipartisanship in that.
Yeah. It's, I guess I wouldn't support that, because this is a group of of really distinguished mainly academics, not all, but mainly, who are doing this, they're basically not paid, as you said, and they do it for public service and to help us. And I would just want to keep them out of the political realm as much as possible. Be as transparent as we are, and your staff can attend the meeting. I mean, we have, lots of congressional.
All right, I'm going to have to absorb that and kind of think about that for a while before I press on with it. But thank you very much.
I'm happy to come and talk more about it.
And 1770, did you write that down?
I got it,
House
1717.
Resolution 1770.
And the gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes for questions.
Appreciate you being here today and submitting yourself to these questions. Appreciate the help you were a day or two ago with the information in my other committee, the Ed and Workforce Committee, on the cost of the higher ed reform bill that we're looking at. I want to talk about accuracies, and particularly as it relates to the Inflation Increase Act. Say it again, the Inflation Increase Act. I may refer to it as the IRA, but it's not the IRA, it's the Inflation Increase Act. And it's now even admitted that it really wasn't about reducing inflation, of course, and it never was. But part of how that was sold by the administration, by what was then the majority party in the House and the current majority in the Senate as well, was, it was supposed to cost less than $400 billion. And now we've got Goldman Sachs saying 1.2 trillion. You got Credit Suisse saying 800 billion. And I think there's acknowledgement that, and mostly because of the climate credits, I guess. But can you speak to that inaccuracy of how that was sold and presented by the administration and the majority party at the time, and we've missed so poorly on that?
I can. I'll say something now. And in a week, when we publish our economic update, we will have a full page or two going into the details. So we'll get you more in writing. The score was from the Joint Committee on Taxation, that anything tax they do, and then we update it. What's changed is there's been subsequent regulation. So the EPA put out a tailpipe emissions regulation that we think is going to basically push people toward electric vehicles. So that means more people are going to take up that EV tax credit. The administration implemented the credit in a way.
I may interject for a second.
No,
it looks
please,
like
please.
the consumer's actually going the other way right now on
that's
electric
right.
vehicles.
No, that's right. That's right. And the EPA regulation is right now it's a proposal. It's meant to, according to EPA, take effect for the 27 model year. Will it actually happen? We don't know, because it really would go very far in pushing people toward electric vehicles. And as you said, that doesn't seem to be the market demand at the moment. So we're going to have to track it, but that would be the effect of greatly increasing the cost of that part of the bill. And I'll just say other provisions.
That portion alone responsible for some nearly $1 trillion to be off with this?
It's about a third of the original JCT score was 400 something billion, and it's going to go up. It's not going to get up to $1 trillion, but it'll be like the 800s. And about a third of the difference is going to be that EPA regulation by itself.
Well, with respect to the Inflation Increase Act generally, will you give the scoring rubric on how you calculated this to Congress so we can look at it?
We can do that. I mean, in the report we publish next week, we won't go into the technical details, but we can provide that to you, to your staff.
I think that would be important for appropriate oversight and accountability. And there is some perception that you may or may not be aware of. I don't know if it's been alleged today that CBO has leaned left, has leaned the other side. And I will, with the IRS funding, it was projected, the increased IRS funding that was part of the Inflation Increase Act, it was projected that it would bring in $2.9 billion in fiscal year 23, but it only was $160 million. This year, CBO has projected the IRS funding would bring in $7.8 billion this year, but so far it's only $360 million. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a challenging part for us, because we have to figure out, well, where's the IRS going to spend their money and how quickly? They wouldn't tell us. Maybe they didn't even know at the time. And so we just said, okay, they're going to put the money in the place where they get the highest return, from the past studies. In the end, they did it differently. They went into customer service. So as you said, they didn't spend the money on the kind of tax
And
collection.
again, that's some of the justification that they made for the IRS expansion was here's the revenues going to come from it. But conversely, if you go back to the TCJA tax bill from a few years ago, CBO projected revenue be 22.6 trillion from 2018 to 23, but actual revenue was over $1 trillion higher, 23.6 trillion than what was projected.
Yeah, yeah. So, there's so much water under the bridge since, so many developments since the TCJA. We said that would boost investment. It did. We said that would boost GDP. It did. And it would boost revenue. In the middle of 2018, there were a large set of tariffs put in place that went in the other direction with business investment. And we can't separate out those effects. And then, of course, the pandemic. So yes, and the subsequent high inflation. So revenues are higher, exactly as you said. How much of that is TCJA? How much of that is the inflation? We can't parse those out.
My time has expired. Thank you, sir.
Okay. No, thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman, seeing no other members to ask questions. I do have several letters from authorizing committees to submit for the record, highlighting the need for oversight and stronger collaboration between CBO and Congress. These include letters from the Committee on Ways and Means, Committee on Agriculture, Committee on Veterans Affairs, Committee on Small Business, Committee on House Administration, the Committee on Armed Services. I also have submissions for the record from stakeholders about reforms to the CBO and increasing transparency, including the Cato Institute, Americans for Prosperity, Economic Policy and Innovation Center, and an opinion letter published in the Wall Street Journal titled How to Keep the CBO Honest When It Scores Spending Bills. Director Swagel, I want to thank you for spending so much time with us today and appreciate your candid and forthright answers to the questions. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will, in fact, be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions or extraneous material for the record may do so within